Good morning. My name is Jim Alley. I'm the owner of Profile Racing. Profile Racing is celebrating its 50th year in business this year, believe it or not. And we have some exciting things going on this year for our 50th anniversary. This being one, it's properly named as the Dungeon. And the Dungeon is our old shop is what it was, and we built a new facility down the road in 2004. And this shop is sort of a time capsule here. Things were left here, old product, all kinds of neat stuff, which goes back to sort of our introduction actually into the BMX industry back in the late 79, early 80s. So we think we got a great thing here. I think everybody's going to enjoy this. It's going to be mysterious. You're going to see some great product. And so we're gonna move forward here and show you, start out with some items I think will be very interesting to you. What we're going to go through here is our first product that Profile made for the bicycle industry. This was back in the late 1979, early 80. Coming out of the race car business, I had an idea going to the races because my son and daughter were getting involved at that time. I watched these young fellas and girls sitting on a gate and their cranks flexing up and down, and I decided what I'd like to do is I thought I could build a better product. So what I did is I went back to the shop the next couple weeks. I took some 4130 sheet metal that I had, went to my bandsaw, I cut out some samples of what I was going to do, built two prototypes. One of them was for Corey. The other one actually was for a fellow by the name of Scott Lindstam, who was actually a factory thruster rider at that time. So realizing that the popularity of people seeing these, we decided we'd go into production on it. But the cost of cutting these out with a bandsaw just wasn't going to be cost effective for us. So we decided, I went to a good friend of mine who was a die builder. So we built a die to stamp the flat part of the crank out and the back piece for the crank. And down here we have the first large piece here. We're punching out the crank, and we're punching out the back piece for the crank. Now this is the female part of the die. This other die here is what they call the male part, and what it does, this goes down and actually punches through the female parts there, and you wind up with two pieces. You wind up with a flat piece, which you would fold up, which would be the box, and you'd wind up with the back piece that would be fabricated onto the back side. And then of course we had to make the large boss and the pedal boss. And the idea of how we were going to attach this came from the 48 spline that I used on my race car steering gears. And we decided we had the tooling, we didn't have to make any investment in that. So our first set of cranks in 1979 had a 48 spline axle on it, and the rest is really history. You know, we changed the industry. It's became the standard of the industry. You know, and that's kind of the story behind that. Anyway, here is what we have is a piece of sheet metal. What we would do is they're about 6 foot long. They're about 8 inches wide. This is 4130 sheet metal, and this would be progressively pushed through this punch and stamp these parts out, and you can see progressively where it was sort of pushed through and cut the pieces out for the crank. And that's how it all started, our retro crank back in late 1979. Yeah, as we talked earlier on from the Dungeon here, we talked about a time capsule, and here's a typical example of a time capsule that was left here when we moved out of this shop in 2004. This was a welding table here, obviously, and these are some of the crank fixtures. We had 3 full-time welders that sat here all day and did nothing but weld bike cranks. One would tack, other 2 would weld, and this was our production table right here for all our bike cranks. This is one of the 3 original welders that we put in place back in 1980. We purchased 3 of these welders for each one of our welding machines for each one of our welders. This was a very high-end welding machine that we had because of the large amount of production that we were doing. This is an argon gauge here. This is an original gauge that we had on the machines back in the 80s there. What this did, this went on a large argon tank. It feeded argon into the torch, and the argon actually produces an atmosphere around the welding tungsten that's on the end of that torch, and keeps the weld from getting contaminated during welding. So if you've seen good heliarc welding and you look at it, it's quite an art, and it's really a pretty weld. So there's some cranks that were sort of left here, I guess. Like I said, we continue to talk about this time capsule, and I'm really excited to show this to everybody because it's definitely a great part of the history of profile racing. Talking about another part of our shop here that we still do use on a regular basis. This is an area here where we stockpile all the chromoly blanks that have already been milled. There's cranks that are from 180 all the way down to 165 millimeter that are all in these crates right here. Our production goes from here. Our welders pick it up, take it, and our cranks are then welded off premises now. Everything is welded off premises by a lot of our welders. I'd like to sort of end this episode here of From the Dungeon. This is an original, actually what we did is we came across a small cache of original literature from the early 80s. This particular piece of literature right here was one of our first ads we did. It was a color ad. It was a big deal for Profile to spend the money to do a color ad, but we thought we needed to do color to accent our product a little bit better and help move profile racing forward in this industry. So thanks for tuning in for episode number 1 of From the Dungeon. Stay tuned for number 2 From the Dungeon coming up here soon, and for more information go to profileracing.com.